Whose freedom of speech? Politically correct censorship. On the 31st of March 1992, I phoned the features editor of the Sydney Morning Herald to ask if he'd be interested in looking at an article I'd written. "What's it about?" he asked. "Women, violence and pornography. Basically, I'm arguing that because it's got negative effects on society, pornography needs to be restricted." I don't think I'd agree with you on that." A slight pause, then hurriedly, "But of course that would not affect my decision whether to publish or not." "I'm sure it wouldn't," I replied hopefully. Well, why don't you send it to me, and I'll take a look at it?" So I did. It took some time to get a response, but when this finally eventuated, the answer was, "Sorry, not interested, and besides that, the Herald was planning to run another article on the topic, and the two would be a bit much." I waited with some eagerness for the promised article, and waited and waited. It finally appeared 5 weeks later. A reprint from the New York Times by the American novelist John Irving. It was a passionate rejection of any form of censorship or restriction, seeing such things as an attack on freedom of speech. Its argument was not based on research, but mostly on a short story written by Nathaniel Hawthorne in 1837. Nor did Irving deal with any of the causes canvassed in my article, which had been concerned with images rather than words, and focused on photographs and electronic visual imagery rather than print. In short, the published piece experienced a viewpoint that was quite the opposite of mine, but without touching on the issues I had raised. However, it allowed the editor to argue with apparent legitimacy that the issue had been covered. Indeed, I'd probably have accepted the argument myself had it not been for my next experience. I submitted the article to the Australian. Again, it was rejected. Well, such things happen, I thought, and perhaps it was not well written. But lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, what should appear in the Australian but an article on the same subject by Patrice Faust. Again, the argument was a passionate rejection of censorship. Again, the issues of which I have concern were not discussed. Again, Patrice Faust probably had no knowledge of my article and its concerns. Once again, an editor had a cozy excuse. Once again, it could be said that the issue had been covered. Yet had it? If one cannot gain expression for a particular perspective, but only for arguments that oppose it, is that freedom of speech? I am unaware of the personal views of the second editor. He did not share them with me, although the tenor of the article he chose might tempt me to make certain assumptions. But the first editor did, and so it's reasonable to conclude that he would see any form of restriction of expression as a denial of the freedom of speech. Yet he and his colleague both denied me the freedom to express a point of view he did not share. The saga continued. Next I tried the Bulletin, more at a sense of mischief than any serious expectations that the magazine would run the piece. After all, I'd taken its publisher to task over the visual images of women in his other publications, People and the Picture. The result was as expected, but I was impressed with the honesty of the editor giving the news. Our publisher is negotiating with governments and on the forefront of this issue. Consequently, the magazine could hardly be expected to present an opposing view, I was told. The next port of call was the Daily Telegraph Mirror, whose editor not only accepted the article, but also told me it was very well written, a comforting and important reassurance after so many rejections. So I waited for it to be published, and waited and waited. Hopeful checks with the editor got the response that the opportunity had not come up yet, as there was so much happening, and later, after the story had been gathering dust for some months, I was told it was not topical at the moment. Several years later, I am still waiting for it to be topical. As for the other editors, I am forced to wonder. Perhaps there was no intended hypocrisy, but it is very difficult for me to reach any other conclusion that I was censored, that viewpoints like mine should not be aired. I'm reminded of George Orwell's 1984, whereby a whole government department, the Ministry of Truth, was devoted to the dissension of the politically correct point of view and the exploitation of others. Nor am I being devious here, in arguing freedom for my speech, while apparently being willing to deny it to others, in my concern about pornography. My article and my private member's bill on pornography were about images, visual depictions that go directly into the right brain without any of the analysis that accompanies the left brain activities such as understanding print. Susan Brownmiller makes a different point: the need to discuss and distinguish between political freedom of speech and the pornographic dehumanization and the degradation of women, as discussed in Toto, I Don't Think We in Kansas Anymore. I've since had an article on pornography published in Quadrant, a revised version of what is included in this book. It is a longer, more detailed piece than the one that was submitted to the newspapers, and at last I've been able to get my view across, although to a far smaller audience than the major metropolitan newspaper provides. Were it not for Quadrant, I might have been tempted to conclude that the Australian media are the latter-day bureaucrats of the Ministry of Truth.